The sun was sliding low in the western sky, painting the horizon in long strokes of orange and crimson. The air was dry, and every breath carried with it the dust of the open range. The creak of leather and the faint clink of spurs were the only sounds breaking the silence of that lonesome stretch of land. It was the kind of silence a man could get used to, the kind that pressed against him like a blanket, reminding him of just how far he was from towns, noise, and the rush of younger days. The cowboy had lived through plenty of seasons on this land, each one carving a deeper line into his face and stiffening the bones in his back. He wasn't old, not yet, but there was no denying that he was on the far side of his youth, middle-aged, weathered, and quiet. He had settled into the rhythm of a life that asked little and gave even less. But on this day, the quiet he had come to treasure was about to be broken. His son, a strong and restless young man, had returned from a long journey. The boy had gone off chasing adventure, carrying that fire only the young seem to have, the kind that pushes them to prove themselves against the world. The father hadn't expected much in return. He'd seen enough to know that life had a way of dimming that fire, sooner or later. Yet the son came back not with just stories or a handful of coins, but with something far heavier, something that carried its own weight of meaning. A gift. That was the word the son had used. A thank dashed at the cowboy's boots shifted in the dirt as he looked at what stood before him. She was a young Apache woman, her dark eyes steady and unblinking, her face marked by dust and sun. Her hair was braided neatly, adorned with feathers and beads that spoke of her people, her heritage, her spirit. Around her neck hung a sign, rough wood with a word scrawled in black paint. Gift. She stood silent, her chin raised, though the rope tied loosely around her wrists told a story that didn't need words. The cowboy felt the ground tilt beneath him. He had received horses as gifts before, even a rifle or two, but this was something altogether different. A human being standing proud yet trapped, offered as though she were no more than a token of gratitude. His son's eyes were burning bright as he handed her over, eager as if expecting praise for the gesture. But the father's gaze lingered not on his boy, but on the woman before him. And a storm began to stir quietly in his chest. The land around them was still, yet the moment seemed to hum with tension. The cattle lowed softly in the distance, and a hawk circled high overhead, watching as if it too understood that something important was unfolding on that patch of earth. The father's hand brushed against the rough leather of the rope hanging at his side. He knew the world he lived in, the way men justified their actions, the way victories were claimed and trophies taken. But this wasn't a steer to be branded or a wild horse to be broken. This was a person. The Apache woman's eyes didn't flinch. They didn't plead. She looked at him as though she could see through the years of dust and wear, as though she knew something about him. Even he didn't. He felt her silence more than if she had shouted. It was the kind of silence that demanded an answer, the kind that cut deeper than any blade. The boy's voice cut in sharp against the stillness. "She's yours now, Pa. You earned her." The cowboy turned his head slowly toward his son, the weight of the words pressing heavy on him. He had raised this boy, taught him how to ride, how to shoot, how to carry himself in a world that could be cruel. Yet here the boy stood, proud of what he thought was a fine gesture. The father's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak right away. Words, he knew, carried power, and once they left your mouth, there was no pulling them back. The Apache woman shifted, the wooden sign clattering softly against the fringe of her dress. For just a moment, the cowboy saw not a gift, not a burden, but a challenge standing before him. A challenge from his son, from the world, from fate itself. He could feel the weight of the choice pressing in on him, and it was a weight he had never asked for, but could not ignore. The wind picked up, tugging at the dust and carrying it across the open yard. The son waited, his chest swelling with pride. The father stood still, his mind caught between duty, blood, and the uneasy stirrings of conscience. And the Apache woman, with her steady gaze and unbroken silence, seemed to hold the answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. For the first time in years, the cowboy felt uncertain. The ground beneath his boots no longer felt steady. The horizon no longer promised peace. He knew that whatever came next would not be simple. It would not be clean. It would not be something that could be buried under the dust of the range. He took in a long breath, tasting the grit of the earth, the weight of history, and the fragile thread of the moment. His hand hovered at his side, his eyes locked with hers. Somewhere in that quiet standoff, he felt the world shifting, as if the course of his life had been nudged off its track and set on a new, uncertain path. The boy smiled, waiting for a word of approval. The father's lips parted, but no sound came. The Apache woman lifted her chin higher, unafraid, her silence louder than any voice. And in that silence, the choice hung in the air, sharp as a knife's edge. Waiting to fall one way or the other? Would he accept her as the world expected? Or would he take a step no one could predict? The cowboy's next move would decide more than just the fate of one woman. It would decide the measure of the man he had become. The dust swirled. The hawks circled lower, and the evening sun burned hotter on their shoulders. As the moment stretched thin, ready to break, the cowboy stood there, shoulders square against the wind, his eyes steady on the woman before him. He could feel the weight of his son's pride pressing down from one side, and the silent defiance of the Apache woman pressing from the other. It was a standoff of sorts, though not the kind he was used to. He had seen his share of gunfights, and he had broken his share of wild horses, but this was different. This was quieter, heavier, and far more dangerous. It was not a question of bullets or ropes. It was a question of who he truly was when all the dust settled. His son shifted his boots in the dirt, impatience flickering across his young face. The boy didn't see what his father saw. To him, this was simple. A gift, an offering, something to mark a bond between blood. In his eyes, it was proof of his strength, of his ability to bring something back to the man who had given him life and lessons. The boy's jaw was set. His chest puffed with that untested pride only the young could carry without bending under it. Wait, the father remembered being that age once, long before the lines etched themselves into his skin. He had once believed the world was as clear as day and night, good and bad, winning and losing. Time had worn those edges down, teaching him that most of life was a shadow that shifted with the light. He had lived long enough to see the cost of choices made in anger or pride, and he knew that this gift was no simple matter. The Apache woman's silence was not weakness. He could see it plain as day. She was proud, unbroken, her gaze locked on him with something stronger than defiance. It was a test, though not the kind a man could measure with a gun or a fist. Her presence stirred something deep in him, something he had pushed down through the years. He remembered the stories he had heard about her people, about the wars and raids, about the blood spilled across the land when settlers pushed further west. He had been taught to see them as enemies, but standing here, face to face, he found it harder to paint her with the same brush. Behind her eyes was a fire, one that would not bow to chains or wooden signs. That fire told him she was not just a girl stripped of her freedom, but a piece of history, a piece of a people who had been fighting to hold on to their world as it slipped away. The cowboy shifted his jaw, uneasy. He had not asked for this burden, but now it stood before him, demanding to be faced. The son finally spoke again, his voice sharp. "She don't say much, Pa, but she'll learn her place. You'll see." The cowboy's eyes flickered to the boy. He wanted to speak, to tell him that not everything could be bent or broken into shape, but he held his tongue. Words could build walls as quickly as they could tear them down, and he knew the time wasn't right. Instead, he turned back to the woman. Her shoulders were straight, her breathing steady, her chin lifted against the weight of the sign. She didn't need to speak for him to hear her. The ranch stretched wide around them, the fences running like scars across the land. The cattle grazed quietly, their movements slow and steady under the fading sun. It was a land he had worked for years, a land he had spilled sweat into, building a life from soil that had no mercy. He had always believed this land was his, earned with his own hands. But now he felt a stir of doubt. Whose land had it been before? And what did it mean to hold it when others had lost everything to the same earth? That night, as the sky turned black and the stars lit up overhead, he sat on the porch with a cigarette burning low between his fingers. His son had turned in, resting easy under the belief that his gift had been well received. The woman, however, was not so easy to forget. She sat by the small fire near the barn, her profile lit by the glow, her eyes fixed on the flames. The wooden sign had been set aside, leaning against a post. She was bound still, though loosely, enough to move, but not enough to leave. The cowboy watched her from the shadows of the porch. Her stillness carried weight. It reminded him of the long nights he had spent on cattle drives, when the land stretched so far and wide that a man could lose himself in it. Her silence reminded him of the hush that came before a storm, when the world held its breath, waiting for something to break. He thought back to the boy's words. She'll learn her place. The phrase echoed in his mind, and with it came a sharp unease. He had worked his whole life to give his son something better, to teach him how to stand on his own. Yet here was proof that somewhere along the line, something had gone wrong. Or maybe it had been the world itself that had shaped the boy into what he was. A world that told him to take, to claim, to own. The cowboy crushed the cigarette under his boot and leaned back in the chair, his eyes still on the fire by the barn. He wondered what the woman thought of him. If she saw him as just another man like the rest, or if she sensed something different. He wasn't sure himself. The days that followed did little to ease the weight pressing on him. The son carried on proudly, speaking of the battles he had fought, the men he had outwitted, the danger he had faced to bring back this gift. He told the stories with fire in his voice, his eyes shining with the thrill of victory. The father listened, but his gaze always drifted back to the woman. She did not react to the boy's words. She did not flinch, did not drop her eyes. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity, as though nothing said could strip her of what she knew herself to be. The cowboy found himself studying her more than he cared to admit. Not just her silence, but the way she moved. The way she seemed to belong to the earth beneath her feet in a way he had never seen. Even bound, she was not conquered. She was part of something larger, something the fences and cattle and rifles could not contain. He had lived on this land for decades, yet standing near her, he realized he was still a stranger to it. At night, the dreams began. He saw the land in ways he had never seen it before, filled with shadows of riders moving swift and sure, their cries echoing against the canyons. He heard drums in the distance, a steady beat that stirred something deep in his chest. And always there was her face, watching him, silent but unyielding. He woke each time with sweat on his brow, his breath caught in his throat. The boy noticed his father's restlessness, but mistook it for unease about the gift itself. "You'll get used to it," he said one morning, grinning as though it were a small matter. "She's just one of many. The land's full of them, if you know where to look." The cowboy's stomach turned at the words, though he kept his expression steady. He wondered if his son understood the weight of what he was saying, or if he had been blinded by the hunger of conquest, the desire to prove himself stronger than others. The Apache woman remained silent through it all, but her presence grew louder in his life each day. She became a mirror he could not look away from, reflecting back not only the man he was, but the man he had been and the man he might become. Her silence spoke of things he had never questioned, of truths buried beneath the dust and the fences, and with each passing day the choice before him grew heavier. To accept what his son had given was to turn away from something stirring deep inside, something he wasn't ready to name. To refuse it, however, was to risk breaking the fragile bond with his boy, a bond built from years of shared labor, lessons, and blood. The land held its silence, but the cowboy felt the storm building inside him. It was not yet time to act, not yet time to speak. The moment hadn't arrived, but he knew it was coming. He could feel it in the wind that swept across the plains, in the restless beat of his own heart. And in the unyielding gaze of the woman who refused to bow, somewhere ahead, a reckoning was waiting. He didn't know when or how it would come, but he knew there was no turning away from it. The path had been set the moment his son had placed that gift before him. And now each step carried him closer to a truth that could not be avoided. The cowboy lit another cigarette, staring out across the endless horizon, knowing that peace was slipping further from his reach with each passing day. The Apache woman sat near the barn, the firelight flickering against her face, her silence still unbroken. her eyes still fixed on something far beyond the fences, and in that quiet. The air trembled with all that was unsaid, all that was waiting, all that was yet to come. The days passed with the weight of something unsaid hanging over the ranch like a storm cloud that refused to break. The cowboy kept himself busy, riding the fences, checking the cattle, mending what needed fixing. His son worked alongside him, though always with that same restless energy, that hunger to prove himself. The boy's pride in what he had brought back did not fade. If anything, it seemed to grow each day, as if he believed the woman's presence was proof that he had become a man worthy of respect. Yet the father felt no pride when he looked at her. He felt something else entirely, something he could not yet name but could not ignore either. The Apache woman moved with quiet grace, even in her confined space near the barn. She did not complain, did not cry, did not lash out. Her silence was not the silence of defeat. It was steady, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The cowboy found himself watching her when no one else was looking, studying the way she carried herself. The way she never dropped her head even under the heavy stares of the men who passed through the ranch. Some of the hired hands whispered among themselves, uncertain what to make of her presence. They knew better than to speak openly in front of the cowboy, but their glances told the story well enough. The woman unsettled them, though they couldn't say why at night. When the wind whistled through the mesquite and the coyotes cried in the distance, the cowboy lay awake longer than he cared to admit. He remembered the faces of men he had lost on cattle drives, the long roads traveled, the times when survival meant making hard choices. He had never thought much about right and wrong. Out here, right was what kept you alive. But now, staring at the ceiling of his cabin, he began to wonder if survival had blinded him to something deeper. His son noticed his unease, but mistook it again for something else. "You're thinking too much on it, Pa," the boy said one evening, as they sat by the fire with tin cups of coffee in hand. "She's a gift, same as any other. You earned her. I brought her back for you." The cowboy studied his son's face in the glow of the fire. There was pride there, but also something harder, something shaped by the rough edges of the world. He wondered if the boy's heart had already been turned by the violence he had seen and the victories he believed he had won. He wanted to tell him that not everything a man takes is truly his, that some things carry a cost too high to bear. But he held back, choosing silence once more. The tension deepened when a group of neighbors rode in one afternoon. They came to share news of trouble brewing not far from the ranch. There had been talk of Apache raiding parties, of stolen cattle, of ambushes along the trails. The men spoke in low voices, their words heavy with suspicion and fear. When their eyes fell on the woman near the barn, their voices grew sharper. "You're keeping her here," one of them asked, his tone laced with unease. "That's dangerous business. You don't know who might come looking for her." The cowboy kept his face calm, but inside his chest his heart thudded like a drum. He knew they were right. Keeping her here was not just a matter between him and his son anymore. It was a matter that could draw fire onto the ranch, fire that might consume more than he could protect. Yet when he glanced at her, sitting by the barn with her chin lifted, he felt that same pull, that same unspoken challenge. To hand her over would be simple, but it would be a choice that branded him in ways no iron ever could. After the neighbors left, the boy scoffed at their warnings. Let them talk. They're afraid of shadows. She's nothing to worry over. If her people wanted her back, they'd have tried already. The father said nothing, but doubt gnawed at him. He had seen enough battles to know that patience was a weapon, and silence often came before the strike. The Apache woman's stillness only fed that unease. It was as though she knew something they did not, as though she was waiting for a moment none of them could yet see. One night, the stars shone cold and clear. The cowboy heard movement near the barn. He rose quietly, slipping into the shadows, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. He found his son there, standing close to the woman, speaking in a low, eager voice. The cowboy couldn't make out the words, but he saw the way the boy's hand brushed against the rope at her wrists, the way he tried to meet her gaze. She did not answer, did not even turn her head. She sat as she always did, silent, proud, her eyes fixed on the fire. The father stepped back into the darkness, his chest tightening. The boy's need for approval, for power, was growing into something more dangerous than he had realized. The days grew hotter as summer pressed down on the land. The cattle kicked up dust, the streams ran lower, and tempers among the hands grew shorter. Trouble was brewing beyond the ranch as well. Stories came of settlements burned, of wagons ambushed, of men vanishing on lonely trails. The name of the Apache people was spoken with fear, sometimes with anger, sometimes with hatred. The cowboy listened, but said little, though the words burrowed deep into him. Each story made the presence of the woman by the barn more complicated, more dangerous, and yet he could not bring himself to turn her away. One evening, as the sky bled red and purple across the horizon, he sat with her for the first time. He brought no rope, no weapon, only the quiet weight of his presence. She did not look at him right away, but when she did, her eyes burned with something fierce. They sat in silence for a long while, the fire crackling between them. Finally he spoke. "You're not what they say," he said softly, almost to himself. She did not answer, but he felt the truth of her silence pressing against him. He realized in that moment that words were not needed. She had already said more with her gaze than any tongue could. The boy saw them together later, and his jaw tightened. He did not speak of it, but the crack between father and son widened that day. The boy believed his father should take pride in what he had brought, should claim it fully. But instead, the old man sat in silence with the gift as if it were no gift at all. The conflict seeped into every corner of their lives. The ranch was no longer just a place of work and sweat. It became a battlefield of unspoken words, of glances and silences that cut deeper than steel. The hired hands grew restless, the neighbors grew suspicious, and the son's pride twisted into something darker. The cowboy felt it all pressing in. The weight of his son's expectations, the judgment of the neighbors, the danger of the world outside, and the unyielding gaze of the woman who sat by the barn. He did not know how long he could carry it, but he knew the storm was not far off. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the crack of thunder that would finally split the sky. At night, the dreams grew stronger. He saw fire sweeping across the plains, saw men fall with rifles still in their hands, saw the faces of the lost staring back at him from the shadows. And always, always he saw her, standing tall, silent, watching him with eyes that cut through every lie he had ever told himself. The boy continued to boast, to plan, to speak of a future built on what he had claimed, but the father knew better. The future was not built on what you took. It was built on what you chose to carry. The weight of that choice was heavier than any man could bear alone, and so the tension deepened. The silence stretched, and the storm edged closer with each passing day. The cowboy did not yet know what would break first, his bond with his son, the patience of the neighbors, or the fire in the eyes of the Apache woman. But he knew one thing with certainty. Something was coming, and when it came, nothing on that ranch, nothing in his life, would ever be the same again. The storm the cowboy had felt building finally came. It didn't arrive with thunder or rain, but with riders in the night. The first warning was the distant thud of hooves carried on the still air like a drumbeat. The dogs barked, the cattle shifted restlessly, and the ranch seemed to tremble under the weight of what was coming. The cowboy stepped out of his cabin, the rifle heavy in his hands, his eyes scanning the darkness. He had known this moment would come, though he had hoped it might pass them by. The Apache riders appeared at the edge of the firelight, shadows moving swift and sure. They did not cry out or rush forward recklessly. They simply waited, their presence enough to make the hired hands retreat toward the cabins and barns. The cowboy's son, however, was quick to grab his pistol, eager fire flashing in his eyes. He had waited for a chance like this, a chance to prove himself again. "Stay back," the father said, his voice steady but sharp. The boy's jaw tightened. "We can take them." "They came for her, Pa. She's mine to defend." The cowboy felt the weight of those words strike him deep. She was not his to defend or to claim. She was herself, and the riders had come for her, not for cattle, not for blood, but for one of their own. His eyes shifted to where she stood near the barn. The firelight painted her face, and for the first time since she had arrived, there was movement in her expression. Her eyes softened, her lips parted just slightly, as if she knew this was the moment that would decide everything. The boy raised his pistol, ready to fight, but the cowboy stepped forward, placing himself between his son and the approaching shadows. "No," he said, the word ringing with finality. His son froze, shock flashing across his face. "No, Pa, they'll take her. They'll see us as weak." The cowboy turned his head, meeting his son's gaze. "Strength ain't about talking what don't belong to you. It's about knowing when to let go." The words cut deep, sharper than any blade. The boy's hand trembled around the pistol, his pride fighting against the truth. For a long, tense moment, the air was thick enough to choke. Then, slowly, the father lowered his rifle and turned to the Apache woman. "You're free," he said, his voice low but steady. Her eyes held his, unflinching, steady as ever. Then she stepped forward, past the boy's stunned stare, past the firelight, and toward the waiting riders. They parted for her, welcoming her back into their fold without a word. Not one of them looked at the cowboy with anger or gratitude. They simply accepted what was theirs and prepared to leave. The boy's fury broke like a dam. "You let her go. After all I did. After what I brought back? You just hand her over?" His voice cracked with rage and disbelief. The cowboy's eyes didn't waver. "You brought back something no man had the right to bring. That wasn't a gift. That was a chain, and I won't wear it." The silence that followed was heavier than any gunfight. The riders melted back into the darkness, the sound of hooves fading into the night until only the crackle of the fire remained. The boy stood stiff, his chest rising and falling in anger, his pride shattered. The father turned back toward the porch, the rifle still in his hand. But his shoulders seemed lighter, as if a weight had finally lifted. In the days that followed, the ranch was not the same. The boy barely spoke, his eyes cold, his movements sharp with bitterness. The hired hands whispered about the night, some saying the old man had been wise, others saying he had been a fool. But the cowboy felt no regret. He knew the choice he had made was the only one he could live with. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the land in gold, he found his son sitting by the corral, staring out at the horizon. The boy's face was hard, but beneath the hardness there was something else. Something uncertain. "You hate me for it," the father said quietly. The boy didn't answer at first. Then, after a long silence, he muttered, "I don't understand you." The cowboy leaned against the fence, the wood rough beneath his hand. "You will someday. When you've lived enough, when you've seen enough, you'll know that a man ain't measured by what he takes. He's measured by what he lets go and what he protects." The boy turned his head sharply. "Protect? You didn't protect her? You let her walk away." The father's eyes narrowed against the setting sun. "I protected what she was. Not mine. Not yours. Hers. That's the only kind of protection that matters." The boy shook his head. Anger still alive in him, but quieter now, dulled by confusion and the first stirrings of doubt. The father said no more. He knew words would only carry so far. The rest, his son would have to learn on his own, in his own time. The neighbors came again, curious and wary. When they asked about the woman, the cowboy simply told them she was gone. Some nodded in approval, others frowned in disapproval, but none pressed further. They didn't need to. The land itself seemed to carry the truth now, whispering it through the wind and the dust. Nights grew quieter. The dreams came less often, and when they did, they were different. No longer filled with fire and shadows, but with open skies, wide rivers, a face that no longer stared with challenge, but with calm. The cowboy knew he had done right, though the price was steep. His bond with his son was cracked, maybe broken, but he held on to hope that time would mend it. Weeks later, he rode the fence line at dawn, the horizon stretching endless before him. The land was the same, yet it felt different. Lighter. Free. He thought of the Apache woman often. Wondered where the riders had taken her. Wondered if she remembered the man who had stood between her and chains. He didn't expect her to. It was enough to know that somewhere out there she was walking free, carrying her fire, her silence. Her pride. The boy still worked the ranch, but his eyes had changed. Sometimes the father caught him staring at the horizon, lost in thought, the anger fading bit by bit. He knew it would take time, maybe years, but he hoped the lesson would sink in. The cowboy's own heart carried its scars, but also its truths. Life on the frontier had taught him many things: how to ride, how to fight, how to endure. But this had been his greatest lesson. Not all battles were won with bullets. Some were won with silence, with choice, with the courage to stand alone against what was expected. When the autumn winds came and the leaves turned brittle on the cottonwoods, the cowboy sat once more on his porch, the sky painted in fading light. He lit a cigarette, breathing deep, and felt a strange peace settle over him. He had given up something his son thought was power, but in doing so, he had found something greater. He had found his own measure as a man. The story of the Apache woman and the night she was set free would fade from the lips of neighbors, from the whispers of hired hands, but it would never fade from his heart. And though the boy might not yet understand, one day he would. The land would teach him, just as it had taught his father in the end. The cowboy knew that gifts were not always meant to be kept. Some were meant to be released, to remind a man of the weight of freedom and the cost of chains. And as the last light of day stretched across the horizon, he felt the truth settle deep inside him. A man's worth was not in what he held, but in what he chose to set free. The wind carried the scent of sage across the open plain, and the cowboy leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the endless sky. Somewhere out there, the riders moved like shadows across the earth, and among them, she lived as she was meant to live. That was enough. The land was still, the air calm, and for the first time in a long time, the cowboy felt the weight of peace.